Thanks very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak virtually at this conference. I'm Blaine Curcio from Nova Space, and my apologies for not being able to make it in person, but hopefully I can do next year. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about ground segment in this age of stormy abundance for the space sector. And just a very brief introduction of myself. Again, my name is Blaine Curcio. I'm a senior advisor at Nova Space, formerly Euroconsult. I'm also the founder of Orbital Gateway Consulting, which is a Hong Kong-based company focusing on the Chinese space sector. And within my role at Nova Space, have a dual focus on the global SATCOM market and also on the Chinese space industry. And if you'd like to find me after this, you can find me on LinkedIn, either using my name or the hashtag China Space Guy. And if you're into China space industry topics, do feel free to give me a follow over at Substack at the China Space Monitor. And just a brief bit of information about Nova Space, and then I'll dive into to the presentation today. So, as I mentioned, Nova Space, formerly Euroconsult and Space Tech Partners, in April of this year, those two companies merged to form what is now the global leading powerhouse of professional services dedicated to shaping the future of the space sector. So, offering a range of services across management, technology, consulting, market intelligence, and events. And as you see here, 1,200 clients, more than 130 trusted professionals, really a very good global and diverse team. And I say that in as neutral a way as possible. So, jumping into the topic of the day, New Dawn in Space from Scarcity to Abundance. And so, just to give a very brief overview, I'm going to talk first about the SATCOM market, which is, full disclosure, the market that I know best. I will then talk a little bit about the EO market before finally talking about the impact of all this rapid change across SATCOM and EO. Looking at some recent events, M&A, so other strategic events, and all of this done in the context of the ground segment. And so looking at the SATCOM market, and I think in a sentence we could say, Starlink has been the catalyst for a lot of change, but it is far from being the whole story. So what brought us here? Over the 5 years from 2017 to 2022, the amount of satellite capacity in orbit grew by about 8 times. So as we see in the top left, from about 2 terabits per second to about 16 or 15 and a half terabits per second. Demand grew by about 3.5 times to about 3.5 terabits per second. And this all led to basically flat capacity revenue, down by about 500 million over a 5-year time horizon. Now, all of this is important from a ground segment perspective because obviously this huge increase on the capacity supply side creates a lot more complexity in terms of managing those on-orbit assets. And on the capacity lease side, it creates a lot more requirement of new user terminals. And this is largely driven by high throughput satellites, and probably most everyone here knows high throughput satellites well, but just a short overview of some Nova Space numbers. We have the various industry numbers that I will make available to everyone along with this PowerPoint after the talk. But the one thing that I would recommend as the main takeaway from this slide is the total amount of capacity that we expect coming into the market over the next 5 years. Tenfold increase for NGSO, a threefold increase for GEO, which wearing my kind of neutral hat, I see as being a bit low, but in any case, we see a big increase in capacity coming into the market. And again, this will lead to increasing requirements on the ground segment side as well to bring all this capacity down to Earth and to make it usable. And broadly speaking, this SATCOM space segment innovation, all this new capacity, being driven by two main factors. So the ability for high throughput satellites to bridge the broadband divide and the ability to more efficiently connect mobile platforms. And again, these are things that were possible with satellite communications, as we know, 30, 50 years ago. Well, bridging the digital divide, perhaps not. But in any case, the big catalyst here has been high throughput capacity, frequency reuse, these different technologies that have let satellites go from a few gigabits per second to hundreds of gigabits per second, terabits per second. And just a last point on the space segment, and then we'll dig in a bit more on the ground side in the SATCOM domain. This idea that HTS really has gone from the exception to the rule. So 2004, we had one satellite operator, Telesat, with a high throughput satellite. And this year we welcomed Suparco, the Pakistani space agency to the HTS Club with their PACSat MM1. So again, 36 nowadays satellite operators are using HTS, and showing this is really the rule at this point. And again, on the ground segment side of things, this is requiring more complex gateway networks, larger numbers of user terminals, etc. And so, broadly speaking, if we look at how the space segment has evolved over the last handful of years, we've gone from a relatively small number of geo satellites that are relatively low bandwidth in a modern context, a few gigabits per second, that require a handful of gateways to beam one-way content. That has gone to being software-defined geos with tens to thousands of beams. We have non-geos coming into the market. I'll talk more about that in a moment. These satellites, even in the context of big submarine cables, some of them are moderately high bandwidth, terabit per second type of bandwidth on some of these, and these larger satellites are requiring large networks of gateways. And so we get to a point where we now have a ground segment in the SATCOM domain that could be for a single satellite, 10, 12, 15 gateways across a country the size of Indonesia. We could have a user terminal network that is 200,000 or 300,000 terminals on a single satellite. And we're going to have all of the back end requirements on the software side, on the hardware side, to make sure that all of that works. And broadly speaking, I mean, this is just it's a paradigm shift in terms of the size and scale of the networks that SATCOM is addressing. And the space segment is obviously a big part of that. And at Nova Space, we count capacity. And so capacity is the metric. But obviously, all of that capacity does need a ground segment in order for it to be of any use to anyone. And so to put some numbers on what this looks like, we expect, and I believe that Axis is missing a million digit, but we expect the number of SATCOM terminals to go from something order of magnitude 5-ish million in the field, 6 million maybe in 2023-24, up to 15-ish million or 14 million by 2032. And as we see here, largely driven by broadband access, and that itself, as we see on the right-hand side, is driven by the price of broadband terminals expected to decline most quickly out of all the different terminals. But in any case, big picture trend here is after a half decade of flattish growth, SATCOM user terminal installations are now seeing very fast growth indeed. And again, much of this being driven, at least in the immediate term, by these NGSOs and by primarily Starlink, at least today. And moving forward, I think that the main takeaway here is that there are several other major constellations that are on the horizon, and that this will have a major impact not only on the space segment, but also on the ground segment. Obviously, O3b mPOWER has made quite some progress, and is now they have a number of satellites on orbit. OneWeb is now fully deployed their first generation. Telesat and Amazon are expected to be deploying in the coming years. And then from China, we have, among others, the Space Sail constellation, which launched its first 18 satellites earlier, I guess last month, at the beginning of August. And so we have at least 6 fairly credible non-geostationary constellations. And while certain ones, SpaceX, Starlink, for example, has had a relatively closed system in terms of terminals, most indications are that several of these constellations are going to have more open systems, and that would clearly allow for at least a different type, if not an absolutely larger number of opportunities, but likely a larger number also. And just to give a very small, and again, these slides are available after, but just an order of magnitude of how big the ground segment projects are on some of these constellations. We see here Starlink with more than 190 gateways, of which more than 150 were operational as of Q2 of this year. Eutelsat OneWeb, 43 gateways with 650 antennas in total. And then O3b mPOWER, their 8 core sites, among others. So again, big picture, SATCOM side, space segment has expanded dramatically, and the ground segment is consequentially also expanding dramatically, and that's going to have a significant impact on the ground segment. Moving over to Earth observation and talking about this trend of downlinking petabytes, the idea that the amount of data that satellites are collecting on orbit is increasing at a rapid pace, and that data, again, in order to be of use to anyone, it needs to be able to be downlinked. And so, just taking a high-level look at Earth observation before digging in, the first topic I would mention is that it is a programmatic and a sort of programmatic cycle type of sector, unlike SATCOM, where we see this sort of peaks and valleys of launches. But the undeniable trend here is that we expect more satellites to be launched over the coming, let's say, 10 years than were launched over the previous 10 years. And the other point I would mention is X-band will continue to dominate by downlink frequency, but we also do see a bit more diversity with more S-band down here, a little bit more Ka-band in some instances, and then some other bands, typically Q-band, V-band, and others. And the other point I would mention in terms of recent trends in the EO side as a kind of high-level table setter is this diversifying of the value chain, seeing more third-party ground segment service providers coming in, seeing more ground segment as a service providers coming in, constellation operators, et cetera, and just having more of an ecosystem and allowing this to create more opportunities for the companies that are already here. And all of this data that's being collected on orbit, I mean, obviously it's being used to create absolutely stunning applications, things like 3D maps of cities. And this is, again, it's increasing the demand to have data downlinked expediently and regularly, and most importantly, to have very large quantities of data downlinked regularly. And as I mentioned earlier on the constellations slide, in addition to the various Western entities that we're seeing coming into the Earth observation space, Maxar obviously being well established, ICEYE, Planet, and others, all creating more data, we're seeing also from the Chinese side hundreds in the last several years, hundreds of Earth observation satellites launched, and a consequent expansion in the ground networks that are being used to downlink all of those petabytes of data, as it were. And so looking at the technologies that are driving these changes, on the space segment side, we have software-defined radios, intersatellite links, improved frequencies, and onboard processing. Now, all of these clearly have an impact on how the users collect data and how they downlink the data, how they send that data around. But for the ground segment side of things, I think that the big takeaway is it's just increasing the complexity of these networks, and that's going to increase the need for more adaptable, more flexible solutions on the ground to get this data down. And on the ground segment side of things, on this right side column, we see a bit longer of a list of technologies. I won't read all of them, but again, available for everyone after. We have, among others, cloud-based applications, optical ground stations, and virtualization. And again, all of these technologies really driving this move towards having, greater quantities of data being downlinked and also having characteristics like time, location of the downlink station, latency of getting the data from the satellite to the downlink to the gateway. These are all becoming differentiators that are going to maybe not make or break business cases, but will certainly make a difference in terms of having a better value proposition. And looking at the various timelines for these different technologies, I would say probably more of a slide to be reviewed on your own time after, but just a couple of short highlights. I mean, the idea that several of these Ka-band downlink and also S-band for small sets, these are here already in the here and now, whereas a handful of optical ground stations, electronically steered antennas, these are seen as being a little bit further off, and most of these technologies clearly having some impact on the segment. And so looking at some of the broader impacts of these changes and of this general volatility on the SATCOM and the EO space, and specifically M&A activity, increasing levels of partnerships, and also specialization of entities. So on the M&A activity side, I think in particular in the SATCOM space, the substantial increase in capacity has led to diminishing margins. In some instances, it's led to service providers that have made leases that are, not competitive several years later. And so you have seen some reshuffling and some M&A, as it were. Um, Much of this has had an impact on the ground segment in that it has created vertically integrated entities. But at the same time, most of these mergers and acquisitions have maybe not necessarily involved the ground segment side of things. As we see here, much of it would be either rather far upstream or otherwise more on the service provider side of things. And looking at the partnership landscape, these various trends have caused an increasing diversification of the players within the space. So we see players like AWS, players like Microsoft Azure have become involved, but also we've seen entities like InfoStellar, which is taking kind of Uber for ground segment approach of leasing gateway capacity from gateways all around the world and then reselling it to their customers. So a diversification of the broader industry and a diversifying variety of partnerships being taken on within the ground segment as a service space um, is certainly one of the main trends that we're seeing as a result of all of this volatility. At the same time, vertical integration, as I alluded to in the M&A slide a moment ago, but as we see, just a large number of players are, among other things, manufacturing basebands, RFs, antennas, going into software management, et cetera. And this is to say nothing about further downstream vertical integration, being a service provider in the case of Viasat, for example. Um, and yet, with vertical integration, we've also seen some level of refocusing and as it turns out, unbundling, for lack of a better term. So, as an example, the Eutelsat OneWeb carve out that we saw last month, which seems highly relevant at a strategies in satellite ground segment conference. My totally unofficial 2 cents, not the opinion of Nova Space. It seems like the ground segment business is getting more complicated with things like data centers being co-located at gateways, things like potentially optical ground stations being installed at gateways, et cetera. This is making it more difficult for companies to really specialize in the ground segment, all else equal. Eutelsat OneWeb at the same time is building out this large constellation of non-geostationary satellites, also building out a small number of new geo satellites. Um, and for that, they're going to need more money. And so rather than investing money into both a big constellation and a costly and increasingly complex ground network, Eutelsat OneWeb decided to carve out one of the two and to sell one of them to raise money for the other. And so it's, I think, a commentary on this idea that as both the ground segment and the space segment are becoming more complex, and as it's becoming more CapEx intensive, more, well, let's say more complex and CapEx intensive, um, this is making it more difficult for companies to do both of those things well. And so from again, not speaking on behalf of Nova Space nor Eutelsat, this would seem to be an attempt at focusing on one over the other. And time will tell if that's the way to go. But in any case, certainly a byproduct of this growing complexity on both the ground and the space segment. And so, taking a step back and thinking about how to compete in this abundant but stormy new space sector. So, again, the space industry at large has changed from a situation of scarcity to one of abundance. This applies to SATCOM with satellite capacity. It applies to remote sensing with the amount of remote sensing imagery. And it applies to, launch and various other aspects of the industry. And this is growing substantially the amount of data that's being moved between Earth and space or space and Earth. And again, this could refer to Earth observation data, SATCOM data, or in some cases, even satellite navigation, very narrowband data. And this trend is going to continue moving forward. I mean, we don't expect that the amount of SATCOM or Earth observation demand is going to decline anytime soon. The ground segment is seeing this impact in a number of different ways, and this includes growing unit sales in the SATCOM domain. It also includes certain technology disruption across both SATCOM and Earth observation. And moving forward, we would expect to see the ground segment uh, the ground segment part of the industry to move towards to move towards a situation of growing specialization. So having, entities that specialize in multi-orbit terminals or laser comms or low latency communication. And indeed, we're already starting to see this to some extent, but just this idea that in a more complex industry, you're going to have companies that choose their relatively narrow niches and specialize therein. And likely the most successful companies are indeed going to be the ones that invest strategically into these niches to address that part of the market. So with that, I will leave you with a QR code and a bit more information on Nova Space, including my email address. Again, if you'd like to reach out to me, find me on LinkedIn or at my email. So thank you very much for your kind attention and hope to join you in person next year.